The bikers laughed at Chuck Norris, calling him just an old actor with fake movie fights. But the moment they threw the first punch, they realized this wasn't Hollywood, and they had just picked a fight with the wrong old man. The diner had seen its fair share of rough customers, but tonight it was different. The Iron Serpents, a pack of leather-clad wolves with road dust on their boots and beer foam on their lips, owned the two back booths, like they always did. Their laughter rolled through the air, sharp and mean, the kind that made folks look away, pretend they didn't hear. Betty, the waitress, kept her head down as she refilled coffee cups, hoping the night would pass without trouble. But trouble was already sitting right there, licking its lips. "Come on, sweetheart," one of them crooned, tapping his dirty boot against the leg of a bar stool where a younger waitress stood frozen. "Give us a smile. Ain't polite to serve a man without looking him in the eyes." She shifted uncomfortably, hands gripping the coffee pot like it was a lifeline. Jade, the leader, leaned back, grinning as he watched. "Maybe she ain't got much to smile about," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Or maybe she's just too good for us, huh?" Laughter erupted, thick with beer and bad intentions. The girl took a step back, but Jade was quicker, grabbing her wrist. Not hard, but enough to show her she wasn't walking away without his say-so. That's when the door opened. A gust of hot wind from the highway swept through, rattling the sugar jars on the counter. The chatter slowed. Heads turned. Chuck Norris stepped inside. He moved the way a storm does before it breaks, calm, deliberate, inevitable. The years had added lines to his face but hadn't softened him. If anything, they made him look tougher. His boots, scuffed and worn, barely made a sound on the old tile floor. He pulled off his Stetson, dusted it once against his leg, then set it down on the counter as he took a seat in the farthest booth. A whisper ran through the room. "Chuck Norris." Jade's grin faltered. "Oh, hell," one of the bikers muttered, shifting in his seat. But Jade? Jade wasn't the kind to back down, not in front of his boys, not in front of a room full of nobodies. He pushed his chair back, the wooden leg screeching against the tile, and stood. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at that. A damn movie star in our humble little diner." Chuck didn't move, didn't look up. He just reached for the menu, flipping it open like he had all the time in the world. Jade strolled over, beer bottle dangling from his fingers. "You're Chuck Norris, ain't you?" Chuck let the silence stretch, reading the menu like it held the answers to life itself. When he finally spoke, it was low, measured. "I was last time I checked." A few nervous chuckles from the regulars. The waitress broke free from the biker's grip and hurried to the kitchen, relief plain on her face. Jade either didn't notice or didn't care. "You mind if I sit?" Jade asked, though it wasn't a question. Chuck turned a page. "I mind." The air in the diner thickened, the kind of silence that made people sweat. Jade's jaw worked. His boys watched, waiting. He'd been dismissed. "Now hold on," Jade said, pulling out the seat across from Chuck anyway. "Ain't every day we get a celebrity in town. Maybe we ought to get to know each other." Chuck finally set the menu down, eyes lifting, calm, steady, unimpressed. "I like to eat alone." A pause. Jade's grin returned, but now there was something ugly behind it. "You think you're too good for company, huh?" he asked, leaning forward. "Or just too good for us?" Chuck didn't answer. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip. And that's what did it. The complete and utter lack of fear. Jade had built his whole damn reputation on fear, on the way folks flinched when he raised his voice, on how men backed down when he stepped too close. But this man? This man wouldn't even look up from his damn coffee. The bikers snickered, seeing their leader brushed off like dust on a boot. That made it worse. "Man, get a look at this," one of them said. "Chuck Norris don't wanna play with us." Another chimed in. smirking. Maybe he left his roundhouse kicks in Hollywood. Laughter rippled through the gang. Chuck set his cup down with deliberate care. "You know," Jade said, voice dripping mock sympathy, "I heard all them action scenes you do. They're fake. Ain't no real fighting in movies, is there?" Chuck breathed out slowly through his nose. He was too damn tired for this. One long day on set, one long drive, and all he wanted was a quiet meal. But some men didn't know when to walk away. "You ever been in a real fight, Norris?" Jade pressed, eyes narrowing. "Or is all that just camera tricks?" Betty froze behind the counter. She knew what was coming. Chuck leaned back, finally meeting Jade's eyes. A silence settled over the diner, thick as molasses. Jade swallowed, just once. "Son," Chuck said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "You got two choices." Jade blinked. Chuck nodded toward the front door. "You walk out of here," he said, tapping the table with two fingers, "or you get carried out." The diner held its breath. The bikers shifted, exchanging glances. Jade gritted his teeth. He couldn't back down now. Not in front of them. "Is that right?" he sneered. Then, he reached forward and tipped Chuck's coffee over. The liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto Chuck's lap. "Oops," Jade said, feigning innocence, his voice oozing with mock sympathy. "Guess you're not quick enough to stop that, huh?" A hush fell over the room. The bikers stared, waiting for what came next. Chuck sighed. Slowly, he took a napkin and dabbed at his jeans. No rush, no sudden movements. But something had changed. Jade's smirk twitched. He hadn't gotten the reaction he wanted. That irritated him. "What's the matter, old-timer?" He pressed, leaning in close, the sharp bite of whiskey and cigarettes thick on his breath. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe I ought to teach you some damn manners. Show you what happens when you don't show respect." Finally, Chuck lifted his gaze, those cold blue eyes locking onto Jade's. A weight settled over the room like a storm rolling in from the desert, pressing down on every living soul inside. There was no anger in Chuck's expression. No fear. Just that quiet, steady intensity, the kind that made a man second-guess everything he thought he knew. "You ought to clean that up," Chuck said, voice low, even. Less a suggestion, more a certainty. Jade blinked, thrown for a fraction of a second. Then he let out a sharp barking laugh and turned toward his gang, throwing his arms out wide like this was some big joke. "You hear that?" he crowed. "He wants me to clean it up?" His boys laughed along, but it wasn't the same. Their chuckles felt forced now, lacking the confidence from before. Something about Chuck Norris sitting there, untouched by Jade's posturing, had taken the fun out of it. Jade turned back, his grin thinning into something uglier. "You got some balls, old man," he growled, his voice dropping an octave, thick with threat. "Maybe I ought to knock some of that tough guy act right out to you." He cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing through the now silent diner. Chuck didn't move, didn't flinch. He just leaned back slightly, hands resting loosely on the table, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do that," he said, calm as a man talking about the weather. Jade's jaw tightened. He straightened, puffing up his chest, unwilling to lose face now. Behind him, his crew stirred, ready to back him up if things went south. Betty took a hesitant step forward, her voice thin with nerves. "Jade, don't! Just let it go." But Jade wasn't listening. He never did. "What's it gonna be, Grandpa?" he sneered, his breath coming faster now. "You scared yet?" A faint flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of Chuck's mouth. It wasn't amusement. It was something colder. "Scared?" Chuck echoed, his voice just above a whisper. "Not even a little." The diner held its breath. The air crackled, thick with unspoken tension. And for the first time that night, Jade hesitated. It was small, barely a pause. But it was there. a flicker of doubt crossing his face, a sliver of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he had picked the wrong fight. But pride's a hell of a thing. Jade leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. Then let's see what you got, old man. The stage was set. The diner, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt like a loaded gun, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Jade saw an aging man past his prime. Chuck knew better. The years might have carved lines into his face, but they hadn't dulled the instincts, the kind you don't lose no matter how long you've been out of the fight. A storm was coming, and Chuck was ready. The air inside the diner had thickened, shifting from restless to charged, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. What had once been a space filled with casual conversation and the clinking of silverware now felt suffocating, the silence pressing against the walls. Even the steady hum of the air conditioning seemed to hush itself, as if the building understood that something was about to break. Jade loomed over Chuck Norris, his smirk fading into something sharper, something mean. He didn't like being ignored, least of all by a man he figured had seen better days. To Jade, Chuck was just another washed-up relic, a relic who had overstayed his welcome in a world that no longer needed him. But there was something in Chuck's stare, steady, unreadable, unshaken, that put a hitch in Jade's confidence. Betty, ever the voice of reason, stepped forward, hands gripping her apron like it might anchor her in place. "Jade, honey, don't start something here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You know this diner's a place for folks to eat in peace." She cast Chuck a fleeting glance, a silent plea to let this slide. But Chuck wasn't the one pushing this forward, and he sure as hell wasn't the kind to let a bully set the rules. Jade didn't even turn to acknowledge Betty, his words slick with forced charm. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just having a friendly chat. Ain't that right, Grandpa?" He turned back to Chuck, his sneer stretching wider. "We're just getting to know each other." Laughter rippled from the corner where the rest of the iron serpents were slouched, the sound grating against the suffocating quiet of the room. Chuck didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a napkin, calmly wiped his hands, folded it with care, and set it down neatly beside his untouched plate. Then, unhurried and deliberate, he rose from his seat. It was a simple thing, standing up, but it carried weight. Jade and his crew tensed, their cocky grins faltering for just a second. There was something in the way Chuck moved, a certainty, an ease that didn't match his years. He stood just a little taller than Jade, his face still unreadable, his presence now filling the room like a shadow stretching long at dusk. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," Chuck said, voice steady, low. "But it looks like you are." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They didn't carry a threat, just the cold, undeniable weight of truth. Jade's jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already written off as harmless. "You think you're funny, old man?" he growled, stepping closer, shoulders squaring like a dog puffing itself up to look bigger. "You don't scare me. I've taken down tougher men than you without breaking a sweat." Chuck tilted his head, the faintest ghost of something, amusement, flickering in his expression. "Tougher?" he mused. "Maybe." His voice dipped slightly, sharp as a blade slipping from its sheath. "Better? I doubt it." The remark landed like a slap. Jade's face darkened, a flush of red crawling up his neck. His crew, sensing the shift, burst into exaggerated ooze, fanning the flames of his temper. Now it wasn't just about putting some old-timer in his place. Now it was about saving face. Jade rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles with exaggerated flair, his breath coming heavier, his stance widening like a man gearing up for a fight he wasn't ready for. Betty stepped in again, urgency threading through her voice. "Jade, enough. Don't make me call the sheriff." Her eyes flicked to Chuck, searching for some sign that he'd end this before it got worse. But Chuck remained still, his posture loose, ready. Jade barked out a laugh, barely sparing Betty a glance. "The sheriff?" he scoffed. "You think I give a damn about him? This town's mine. I do what I want." He turned back to Chuck, jabbing a thick finger at his chest. "And right now, I'm gonna teach you a lesson you won't forget." Around the diner, chairs scraped against the floor as the rest of the bikers rose, slow and deliberate. They didn't rush, didn't lunge, they didn't need to. Their sheer presence was enough. The unspoken threat that they had the numbers, that the old man was outnumbered. A murmur spread through the other diners, nervous whispers, the rustling of people shifting toward the exit. A few slid bills under their plates, gathering their coats, not wanting to be in the room when things got ugly. Betty stood frozen, gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Chuck didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. Jade mistook that for hesitation. His mistake. Chuck Norris finally shifted, stepping in just a little closer, his movement steady, deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world. His gaze flicked over the bikers, then settled back on Jade. His voice, low and even, carried no fear, just a quiet certainty. "You don't want to do this." A beat passed, thick with unspoken warning. "You and your boys might not like how it ends." Jade let out a sharp laugh, but the edge in it was hard to miss. "What, you gonna hit me with your walker, old man?" He turned, looking for approval from his crew. "Hell, maybe he's got a slingshot tucked in that jacket." The bikers erupted in laughter, but it was hollow, stretched, too thin. Even they could feel the shift in the air. Chuck said nothing. He took another step forward, close enough now that Jade could see it. The quiet steel behind his eyes, the kind of look that made a man reconsider his choices. The laughter died off, one by one, as the gang noticed the change. That wasn't the face of some washed-up actor. That was something else entirely. Something dangerous. For the first time that night, Jade hesitated. Some part of him, some primal instinct buried beneath all the bravado, screamed at him to stop. But pride had already shoved him too far forward. His fingers curled into fists, his shoulders squared, and his muscles coiled tight. He was too deep in now. No way he was backing down. The diner held its breath. Betty's grip tightened on the edge of the counter, knuckles white. A trucker near the door shifted in his seat, inching just a little farther away. The hum of the neon sign outside buzzed against the thick silence, the only sound in a room that had frozen in time. Chuck exhaled, slow and measured, rolling his shoulders like a man loosening up before something inevitable. He'd seen men like Jade before, loud, arrogant, the kind that mistook noise for strength. They all had to learn the hard way that not all fights were worth picking. His voice cut through the hush, clean and sharp. "Your move, kid." Jade loomed over Chuck, fists clenched so tight the veins in his forearms bulged. His boys leaned in, hungry for a show, convinced they were about to witness something ugly. The rest of the diner sat still, caught somewhere between fear and a twisted curiosity. Betty, usually unshakable, didn't even blink, her lips pressed into a tight line. Jade didn't waste another second. With a roar, more for his gang than himself, he threw a punch meant to end the fight before it started, aiming for Chuck's jaw, a blow meant to make a statement. But the fist never connected. In the space of a heartbeat, Chuck moved. One clean, effortless shift to the side, and Jade's punch cut through empty air. The sudden miss sent him stumbling forward, his own momentum working against him. Before he could recover, Chuck's hand lashed out, catching his wrist in an iron grip. The diner gasped in one voice. Jade barely had time to register what was happening before his arm was yanked forward and twisted at an unforgiving angle. Pain shot up through his shoulder, his knees buckling beneath him as he dropped hard onto the tiled floor. The sharp slap of bone against linoleum echoed loud enough to make some of the patrons flinch. Chuck barely looked fazed. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "First rule," he said. "Don't telegraph your punches." Jade's face contorted, somewhere between pain and outright humiliation. He jerked against the hold, trying to free himself, but Chuck's grip was locked tight, unyielding, absolute. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as the rest of the gang sprang to their feet, the moment of stunned silence breaking like glass. "Let him go, old man," one of them barked, his voice laced with the kind of bravado that came from having numbers on his side. A switchblade flashed open with a snick. The dim glow from the flickering neon lights caught on the blade's edge, a sliver of silver against the low haze of the diner. Betty ducked behind the counter, fumbling blindly for the phone. Hands shaking, Chuck didn't even blink. With a deliberate, effortless motion, he let go of Jade's wrist, only to send the same hand driving straight into the biker's face with a brutal elbow strike. A sickening crack rang out. Jade reeled backward, hands flying up to his nose as blood poured through his fingers. His body hit the floor, a heavy, graceless sprawl. Chuck turned, his posture easy, relaxed, but ready. The rest of the gang hesitated. Like a coil wound too tight, the diner was a second away from snapping. The first biker lunged at Chuck with a knife, his attack wild and reckless. Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, his grip like a steel trap as he seized the man's wrist and twisted. The knife clattered to the floor with a sharp clang. Without hesitation, Chuck drove his knee hard into the biker's gut, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him crumbling to the floor in a heap. Chuck's voice remained steady as he muttered, "Second rule, don't bring a knife to a fight you don't know how to finish." The others hesitated. Moments ago they had seen Chuck as an easy mark, just another aging tough guy playing cowboy. But now? He had put two of them down in mere seconds. Fear crept in, but pride and the rush of adrenaline kept them from backing off. Two of them rushed him at once, hoping sheer numbers would tip the scales. But Chuck was a blur, slipping beneath their clumsy swings. With a swift, precise spin, he lashed out, his boot catching one of them square in the chest. The force sent the man flying backward, crashing into a table with a deafening thud, plates and glasses exploding upon impact. The second one tried to grab Chuck from behind, but Chuck moved faster. An elbow drove deep into the man's ribs, the breath leaving his body in a sharp gasp. Before he could recover, Chuck struck the back of his knee, dropping him like a felled tree. By now, the diner had descended into chaos. Tables overturned, shattered coffee cups littering the floor. Chairs sprawled in every direction. The patrons had pulled back against the walls, watching in wide-eyed silence as Chuck methodically dismantled the gang. Jade, still hunched over, blood dripping from his nose, struggled to his feet, his face twisted in fury and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth and snarled, "Get him!" His voice was thick, muffled by the blood pooling in his mouth. "Take him down!" The last two bikers hesitated. Their leader was giving the order, but their confidence had been shattered. One of them, a wiry guy with tattoos slithering up his neck, flicked his gaze between Jade and Chuck. He licked his lips, unsure. "Man, this ain't worth it," he muttered under his breath, shifting a step back. His partner, a heavy-set brute with a shaved head, didn't look any more eager. Chuck's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You want to end up like the others?" His tone was steady, almost casual, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "Be my guest." The two men exchanged a quick glance, and just like that, whatever bravado they had left crumbled. Without another word, they turned and bolted for the door, their boots hammering against the tile as they disappeared into the night. Now it was just Jade. He stumbled backward, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. His swagger was gone, replaced by something far less certain. He jabbed a trembling finger at Chuck, his voice hoarse with a mix of rage and desperation. "You're gonna regret this, old man." The words came out weak, more empty threat than true promise. "You don't know who you're messing with." Chuck took a single step forward. Jade flinched, his body tensing like a man bracing for a hit. Chuck's voice was calm, but there was no room for argument. "Walk away." His stare didn't waver. "Before you embarrass yourself any more than you already have." For a second, Jade looked like he might try something. One last act of defiance. But whatever reckless thought had entered his mind, it left just as quickly. With a grunt, he turned and staggered toward the door, clutching his busted face. The door slammed behind him. A heavy silence filled the diner. Betty, still gripping the counter, emerged cautiously, her eyes wide with shock. In a hushed voice, she asked, "Are you okay?" Chuck adjusted his jacket, reached for his hat, and placed it back on his head. "I'm fine," he said simply, his voice as even as if nothing had happened. He turned, scanning the room. Every set of eyes in the diner was locked onto him, a mixture of shock and awe written across their faces. "Sorry for the mess." Chuck stood tall, unshaken. The tables were overturned. The floor was littered with broken glass, and groans of pain filled the air. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, clutching the cordless phone with trembling hands, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and awe. The customers, who had moments ago been hunched in fear, now whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but tinged with amazement. "Did you see that kick?" someone murmured. "He moves like he's half his age," another replied, shaking his head in disbelief. But the silence didn't last. Jade, humiliated, wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, his breath ragged with fury. His pride was in tatters, shredded right in front of his crew in a room full of witnesses. His lips curled back and a guttural roar ripped from his throat. He bellowed, his voice raw with rage. "We're not done with him!" For a split second, the bikers hesitated. Their confidence, once unshakable, had been rattled to its core. They had expected a washed-up actor, not a man who fought like a ghost out of a war story. But Jade's barked command snapped them out of it. Reluctantly, they exchanged glances, squared their shoulders, and stormed back into the fray, three of them charging at Chuck at once. This wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about revenge. Chuck didn't flinch. He stood loose but coiled, every muscle primed, his eyes locked on the incoming threat. The first biker lunged, fists swinging wildly, but Chuck stepped to the side with practiced ease and slammed the heel of his palm into the man's sternum. The impact sent the biker stumbling backward, gasping, before he collapsed against a table, knocking over a half-eaten plate of fries. The second one came in heavier, a meaty fist hurtling toward Chuck's head. Without missing a beat, Chuck ducked, his reflexes honed by years of training. The momentum of the biker's own swing left him wide open. Chuck drove his shoulder into the man's gut, lifted him clean off the ground, and slammed him into a booth. Plates rattled, silverware clattered, and the whole damn structure shook from the force of it. The third attacker was quicker, smarter. Instead of rushing in blind, he aimed low, trying to take Chuck's legs out from under him with a sharp kick. But Chuck saw it coming. The moment the biker moved, Chuck pivoted smoothly on one foot and countered with a spinning kick of his own. His boot connected with the man's jaw in a sickening crack, sending him twisting through the air before hitting the floor with a dull thud. Jade, still on his knees, his face contorted with pain and fury, struggled to rise. Chuck's grip on his wrist had left him momentarily stunned, but his rage was sharper than his injuries. Around him, chairs screeched against the floor as the remaining bikers launched themselves into the fight. "Let him go, old man!" one of them shouted, yanking a switchblade from his pocket. The blade gleamed under the flickering neon lights, and a murmur rippled through the diner. Betty, still clutching the phone, instinctively ducked behind the counter, her fingers fumbling to dial. Chuck didn't move, didn't blink. Then, In one swift motion, he released Jade's wrist and drove his elbow into his face. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed through the diner as Jade tumbled backward, his hands clutching his nose, as blood trickled between his fingers. Chuck turned his attention to the man with the knife. The biker lunged, blade flashing, but it was sloppy, desperate. Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, his hand snapping out like a viper to seize the man's wrist. He twisted hard, and the biker yelped, fingers instantly loosening. The knife clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Chuck drove his knee into the biker's gut, knocking the wind clean out of him. The man doubled over, wheezing before collapsing onto the ground. Chuck exhaled slowly, his voice calm but sharp as a razor. "Second rule," he said, his tone as steady as ever. "Don't bring a knife to a fight you don't know how to finish." The bikers froze. A moment ago, they had been cocky, certain they'd rip Chuck apart. But now, 2 more of them were down in a matter of seconds. The man they'd thought was just a Hollywood tough guy had just dismantled their own crew like they were rookie bouncers at a dive bar. Jade growled through the pain, rage overriding common sense. "Get him," he roared. 2 of them rushed Chuck at once, hoping sheer numbers would tip the scales. Chuck moved like a shadow, slipping under their wild swings. One of them overextended. Chuck spun fast, his boot catching the man's ribs and sending him flying into a table, shattering glass and sending plates crashing to the floor. The second one tried to grab Chuck from behind, arms reaching to lock him in place. Mistake. Chuck threw his elbow back, crushing the biker's ribs, then pivoted and drove his knee into the back of his leg. The biker crumpled, his body hitting the floor with a dull, painful thud. The diner was in ruins. Tables overturned, chairs scattered, coffee dripping from the counter onto the linoleum floor. The other customers had retreated to the edges of the room, watching in stunned silence, their meals long forgotten. They weren't scared anymore. They were watching a goddamn legend at work. Jade, battered and bleeding, somehow managed to stumble to his feet, his face twisting between fury and disbelief. He had never lost a fight like this. Yet here he was, on the floor, bleeding, broken, beaten. And Chuck Norris. Chuck hadn't even broken a sweat. Blood dripped from Jade's split lip as he spat a curse, his voice thick with rage and humiliation. "Get him!" he bellowed, the words slurred by the swelling in his mouth. "Take him down!" But the last 2 bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. One, a wiry man with a tangle of ink crawling up his neck, darted his eyes between Jade and Chuck Norris. His fingers twitched, but he didn't move. "Man, this ain't worth it," he muttered, shifting his weight toward the exit. His partner, a stocky brute with a shaved head, seemed just as unsure. Chuck leveled his gaze at them, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. "You boys want to end up like the rest of them?" His words hung in the air, low and steady, like the last warning before a storm. "Next time," he said, "think twice before picking a fight you can't finish." Then he walked out, leaving behind a diner full of astonished patrons and a gang of defeated men who would think twice before crossing him, or anyone like him, again. Out in the parking lot, Jade was pacing, his boots scuffing against the dirt, kicking up small clouds of dust. His body ached, his nose still bled, but none of it stung quite like the humiliation. "We ain't letting this go," he growled, the words hot with frustration. One of his guys, still clutching his ribs, let out a bitter laugh. "And what exactly do you want to do, Jade? Go back in there and get knocked around again?" He wiped at his busted lip. "That guy ain't normal." Jade spun to face him, rage twisting his features. "We can't let some old man make fools out of us," he snapped. "You got any idea what people are gonna say when they hear about this?" He jabbed a finger toward the diner. "We're the Iron Serpents, goddammit. Nobody makes us look weak." But even as he spoke, the fire in his voice flickered. Doubt crept in around the edges, and he hated that his men could hear it. Deep down, he knew they weren't wrong. Chuck wasn't just some aging action star, washed up and living off past glory. They had misjudged him, and they had paid for it. A younger member of the gang, Jesse, shifted uncomfortably. He was the greenest of the crew, always hanging back, always watching. "Maybe we ought to just let it go," he said, hesitant but firm. His eyes flicked to the diner. "You saw what he did, Jade? Hell, we all did. You think he's just some washed-up actor?" He swallowed. "Or maybe he's something else." The others exchanged glances, Jesse's words settling like dust in the wind. What kind of man walks into a fight outnumbered and walks out without a scratch? Jade glared at him, but the weight behind it wasn't what it had been before. His head was too full of that gnawing feeling, one he wasn't ready to name. "Whatever he is," Jade muttered, voice low, "he ain't getting away with it. We'll figure something out." He cracked his knuckles, more out of habit than confidence. "Next time we'll be ready." Inside the diner, Betty stepped out the front door, needing a breath of fresh air. The sky had started to change, the sun slipping lower, setting the horizon ablaze in hues of orange and pink. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her thoughts still tangled up in the man who had come and gone like a storm. Then, she saw him. Chuck Norris was walking along the edge of the highway, his silhouette framed by the dying light. Without a second thought, she grabbed a to-go cup, filled it with coffee, and jogged toward him. "Hey!" she called out. Chuck slowed, turned, his expression as steady as it had been inside the diner. She held out the cup. "Figured you might need this," she said, her voice softer now. "Didn't get to finish yours back there." He accepted the cup with a nod, lifting it slightly in thanks. "Appreciate it," he said, taking a sip. Betty hesitated. There were 100 questions on her tongue, but only one that made it out. "I don't mean to pry," she started carefully, "but who are you? You're not just some retiree passing through, are you?" Chuck regarded her for a long moment, his sharp gaze unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Just a man who's been around long enough to know trouble when he sees it." There was something in his voice, something heavy, a lifetime pressed into just a few words. Betty wanted to push, to ask more. But something in the way he said it told her that Chuck Norris only ever said exactly as much as he wanted to. "Well, whoever you are," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "Thank you. Those guys have been making life miserable around here for years. I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that." Chuck gave her a small, knowing smile, tipping the brim of his hat. "People like that need a reminder they ain't as tough as they think." As he turned to leave, Betty called after him, her voice edged with concern. "Be careful out there, mister. I don't think Jade's the kind to let this slide." Chuck hesitated, just for a beat, his back still to her. Then, in that same quiet, unshaken tone, he answered, "Let him come." And with that, he stepped onto the highway, his silhouette stretching long against the setting sun, swallowed by the dust and the open road. Betty watched him go, an odd mix of admiration and unease settling deep in her chest. On the far edge of town, in a dimly lit garage littered with rusted tools and old oil stains, the iron serpents were licking their wounds. Jade paced like a caged animal, the rage in his eyes burning hotter than the pain in his battered face. His gang slumped around the room, some nursing bruises, others just staring at the floor, the humiliation thick between them. The fluorescent light above them flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. No one spoke. Not until Jade let out a low growl, grabbed a wrench, and slammed it onto the workbench, the loud clang making a few of them flinch. "You got any idea how this makes us look?" His voice was rough, strained, a mix of anger and the lingering ache in his ribs. His cold gaze swept over his men, daring someone to answer. No one did. Jade's lip curled in disgust. "That old bastard made fools out of us," he snarled. "People are gonna think we're weak." His nostrils flared as he inhaled sharply, trying to steady his breathing, but it only made the pain in his ribs worse. His pride hurt even more. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Jesse, the youngest of the bunch, shifted uncomfortably before finally working up the nerve to speak. "Jade, maybe we just let it go," he said, voice hesitant but firm. "That guy, he ain't normal. We all saw what he did." He swallowed hard. "What if we—" Jade's head snapped toward him, eyes cold and sharp. "What if we what?" He cut in, his voice low, dangerous. "Run? Hide? That what you're saying?" He took a slow step toward Jesse, forcing the younger man to lower his gaze. "We're the Iron Serpents," Jade hissed, his voice like barbed wire. Nobody gets away with making us look like damn fools." Jesse clenched his jaw, his face burning with shame. He wasn't the only one who had doubts, but none of the others had the guts to say it out loud. Jade didn't just lead the gang, he ruled it. Crossing him was just about as dangerous as taking on Chuck Norris himself. The wrench hit the workbench again, this time hard enough to send a nearby toolbox clattering to the floor. "We're gonna find him," Jade declared, his voice as sharp as the edge of a knife. "And this time, we're not holding back." He wants to play tough guy? Fine. Let's see how tough he is when we bring the whole damn storm down on him. The gang didn't cheer. No hoots, no hollers, just grim nods. They knew better than to argue, even if some of them weren't convinced this was a fight worth picking. Jade started barking orders, his men moving without question. "Get the gear together. No more games. This time we finish it." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Chuck had settled into a roadside motel. One of those no-name places with flickering neon signs and a parking lot that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The room was simple. Bed, desk, an old TV mounted on the wall. It was quiet. That was all he needed. Sitting at the desk, he cradled a cup of coffee in one hand, the steam curling into the air. In the other, a worn leather notebook lay open, filled with years of sketches, notes, and memories. Some pages were yellowed with time, others newer, but they all carried weight. Lessons learned, battles fought, people met and lost. It wasn't nostalgia that kept him flipping through the pages. It was something else. A reminder of who he was, of why he never took men like Jade lightly, and why they should have done the same. Though Chuck rarely allowed himself to get lost in the past, tonight was different. His fingers hovered over an old photograph, its edges worn from time and handling. It showed him in his prime, barely into his 30s, standing with a group of men clad in karate uniforms. His younger self looked sharp, disciplined, and unshaken, the weight of his experiences not yet carved into his face. But his eyes, the fire in them, was the same then as it was now. He took a slow sip of coffee, his thoughts drifting back to the diner. He knew men like Jade, the kind who mistook volume for authority, who believed control came from making others cower. They weren't dangerous because of skill. They were dangerous because of their pride. And men like Jade didn't take humiliation lightly. Chuck knew this wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before they came looking for him. The night air was still, heavy with the lingering heat of the desert. Chuck Norris stood by the window of his roadside motel room, listening. He could hear them long before he saw them, the low snarling growl of motorcycles, a pack of predators closing in. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. No surprises here. He had seen their kind before. Men who mistook noise for power, numbers for strength. The ones who thought intimidation was the same as dominance. He reached for his jacket, slipping it on like armor. A fight hadn't been on the agenda tonight, but if the Iron Serpents were dumb enough to bring trouble to his doorstep, he had no problem finishing what they had started. Outside, the distant rumble of engines swelled into a deafening roar, as the gang tore into the motel parking lot, headlights slicing through the dark. Gravel crunched beneath heavy boots as they dismounted, moving in a loose half-circle around him. Jade was first to step forward, his face still swollen from their last encounter, his grip tightening around a crowbar. Behind him, the rest of the gang bristled, bolstered by a few new faces. Extra muscle, extra foolishness. Chuck leaned against a wooden post, hands easy at his sides. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Evening, boys. Didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." Jade's lip curled. He stomped forward, his boots grinding into the gravel. "Cut the crap, old man," he spat. "You made fools of us back there. Now it's time to settle up." Chuck tilted his head slightly, the faintest ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "That so?" he said, tone carrying just a hint of amusement. "You think bringing a few extra friends is gonna change how this ends?" Jade's jaw tensed, his grip on the crowbar tightening. "Oh, it's gonna end all right," he growled. "And this time you're not walking away." The bikers spread out, surrounding Chuck in a calculated formation. They weren't going to rush him like last time, not after what they had seen. But even now, there was something different in the air. The confidence wasn't all there. The bravado had cracks, because they had felt what he was capable of. And for the first time, some of them wondered if this was the worst decision of their lives. Chuck dusted off his sleeve, took a slow step forward. His voice, steady and unshaken, carried an undeniable weight. "Last chance to walk away," he said. His eyes locked onto Jade's. "You don't want to do this." Jade let out a dry, humorless laugh, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't get to call the shots here, old man." His grin widened as he turned to his men. "Take him down." The first biker lunged, a heavy chain whipping toward Chuck's head. Chuck moved like a shadow in the wind, ducking just in time. The chain snapped through empty air. Before the biker could recover, Chuck caught his arm, twisted it back with brutal precision, and drove a sharp strike into his ribs. The man hit the ground gasping, curling in on himself. A second man charged, a flash of silver catching the dim light, the glint of a knife. The blade slashed wildly, but Chuck sidestepped, smooth and calculated. In one swift move, he snatched the attacker's wrist, wrenched it sideways and sent his elbow crashing into the man's forearm. The knife clattered to the ground. The biker barely had time to curse before Chuck hooked his leg behind his knee and drove him backward. The man crashed onto the gravel, groaning. A ripple of hesitation moved through the gang. Just minutes ago they had been so sure, laughing, cocky. Now one by one their confidence fractured. Jade saw it happening. His face twisted in fury. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he barked. "Get him!" Two more men lunged. One swung a wooden bat, the other aimed a kick at Chuck's legs. Chuck flowed between them like a storm in motion. He dodged the bat, his stance shifting just enough to avoid the kick. The biker with the bat barely had time to register his miss before Chuck struck. A spinning kick sent the bat flying from his grip. At the same moment, Chuck's fist met the second biker's jaw with a bone-rattling impact. Both men crumpled, hitting the ground hard. Jade's expression darkened. His men, his reputation, were slipping through his fingers. His gang was unraveling before his eyes. With a guttural snarl, he lunged, swinging the crowbar with full force. Chuck caught the movement in his periphery. He stepped aside at the last possible second. The crowbar whooshed past, missing him by inches. Jade staggered forward, thrown off balance. Chuck made his move. A sharp, surgical strike to the wrist sent the weapon clattering to the ground. Jade grunted in pain, but wasn't done yet. He swung blindly, fists flying, but his rage made him sloppy. Chuck read his movements like an open book, dodging, blocking, countering. Every punch Jade threw met nothing but air. Then, with a final precise palm strike to the chest, Chuck sent Jade staggering backward. His boots scraped against the gravel. And then, he fell. The rest of the gang froze. Their leader lay in the dirt, winded and beaten. And Chuck? Chuck hadn't moved an inch. Jade groaned, dragging himself upright, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He looked at Chuck, then at his fallen crew. His fists clenched, but there was nothing left for him to throw. His voice was raw, bitter. "You think this is over?" He spat onto the ground. "You think you've won?" Chuck took a slow step forward, his gaze steady. "It's over when you say it is," he said, voice like steel. "Walk away, learn something, or come back and lose again. Your call." For a long moment, Jade didn't move. Then, jaw tight, he turned on his heel. "Let's go." One by one, the bikers shuffled toward their motorcycles, their bruised pride heavier than their injuries. Engines rumbled back to life, the roar fading into the distance as they disappeared down the open highway. Chuck watched them go, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his jacket, turned back toward the motel. His boots crunched against the gravel, the only sound left in the still night. The parking lot bore the scars of a fight that wouldn't be forgotten. The battle was done, but the lesson would linger. Wow, what a ride! This story isn't just about a fight in a diner or some bikers getting what's coming to them. It's about something much deeper: respect, restraint, and knowing when to stand your ground. Chuck Norris could have fought from the very start, but he didn't. He gave them a chance, a way out. And that's what makes him more than just a tough guy. He's a man who understands power and responsibility. Jade and his gang? They're not just villains for the sake of being villains. They're people ruled by their own pride, their need to prove something. And that's the real lesson here. Pride can be dangerous. It blinds you, pushes you into fights you don't need to be in, and leaves you broken when reality hits. Chuck, on the other hand, has nothing to prove. That's what makes him so powerful. True strength isn't about being the loudest guy in the room. It's about knowing who you are, standing firm, and letting your actions speak for themselves. So, what do you guys think? What was your favorite moment? And do you think Jade learned his lesson? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.